the foundation of confidence really is about content, right? So we talk a lot at BlueSteps and among coaches around this knowledge, the importance of knowledge being king. And obviously it's important because it's not just about knowing the job description, but it's knowing the facts, right? So knowledge being power, if you have understanding of what's going on in the market, for example, or even knowledge of, perhaps a situation that the business is facing, that gives you a leg up and kind of gives you that advantage over others. Now, wisdom is kind of what you do with that knowledge, right? So when you interview someone, you're not only looking for, sort of a fact database, right? You're not looking for a computer or, even something like an artificial intelligent person, right? It's really something about what will this person do with what they know. So when you go into an interview, for example, it's a very weak response to say, well, I know this, or I know this skill or this capability, but it's a lot more responsive and it's a lot more confident of an answer if you can say, well, here's, I can apply my knowledge to your business, your company, or this specific role, or the challenges that you're facing on a daily basis. So I would encourage you to think about the differences between wisdom and knowledge, because we don't talk a lot about wisdom in interviews because it sounds really philosophical, a little bit out there. But really, application of knowledge is what gives people the confidence that, in fact, that you know what you're doing, right, as a leader. And as you go more senior up in the ranks, what people are looking for are your points of view, right? So what is it about putting two pieces of knowledge together that becomes analytical, that becomes insightful, that becomes competitive, compelling, right? Our roles as coaches is not to sell you as a commodity, right? Our job as coaches is to make you so attractive that companies can't help but to want you on their team, right? So demonstrating wisdom is one of those things that you can do to really show and make the case for yourself. And then what facts should you know? So that's a question that is probably individualistic to each of the interviews that you have, right? And also the seniority of where you're going from. So what facts you might need to know from an informational interview is very different than, let's say, for example, if you're at the final round of a committee, right, who might have maybe 4 or 5 different functional heads that are there, and they might ask you different things, right? So what facts should you know itself is also very important, and that gives you the confidence to be able to, respond to any situation that comes up. And we'll see that in the very last slide about staying alert. What does that mean to stay alert? Okay, how about number 2? So knowing the environment. So we talk a lot as coaches about you want to command the environment, right? So when you're having an interview, sure, perhaps you're being questioned more so than the other way around, but you're trying to take ownership. Ownership is not control, right? Ownership of the situation, of the environment, of what questions are being asked, even the tone of the conversation as much as you can. So to do that, you really have to understand what is the market like, right? So what is this company facing in such a way that perhaps they're coming into the interview on a high note, right? They might have succeeded in the past, 3 or 4 quarters, and they're very excited to hire and to augment their team. But in some cases, they haven't done as well. And so we'll talk a little bit later on about what does it mean to know the organization, right? To have that knowledge there. So what is the market like? What is the market like in the past? What is it like in the present? And where do you think it's going to in the future, right? If you can tell a narrative to somebody who is part of that particular industry about, I know where you guys have come from. I know where the markets come from. I know where your competitors have come from. I know where the customers have come from. But here's where they are today, and here's I think where they're gonna go to in the future. And that's the intersect that I have as a leader myself, is to be able to intersect there and really drive the future for you. So that really commands that confidence of knowing the environment, right? So people can see that you're not just about that role or that company, but above a bigger ecosystem than that. Where should the company be going? So if you've been on some of these webinars before, you have heard me use the analogy of the hockey puck, right? Is skating to where the puck is. It's no good to be standing still to get past the puck, right? But it's really important to know where the goal is, right? The net is going to be where the goalie is, and then where the puck's going to be is where you want to go to, right? So part of having confidence is saying, if I were to own this company, or if I were to own this particular functional area that I'm joining, here's what I would do, right? You're going into a little bit of a consulting mode to sort of say, here's what I think you should do. And so that's kind of knowing the environment as a past, present, and future. And then at the end of the day, as I always say, you're getting paid and hired for your point of view. It's your thought leadership that really counts. It's your thought leadership that's going to drive execution throughout the organization. it's going to drive into growth, right? So make sure that you keep that in mind. Don't get too tactical about specific things that you've done, but really more about what do you think, right? That's what they're looking for.
So
Oh,
now we want to
excuse me
talk a little
there.
bit about, yeah, what credibility is and so forth. So when we get into the definition of credibility, it's really the quality of being trusted and believed in. You know, how we establish our credibility in an interview is through the experiences that we share, our superpowers, our challenges that we've faced, what we've learned from our failures. Superpowers is kind of an interesting thing. And in fact, this is where I would love to get some feedback from you, the audience here. You know, if I were to ask you a question, what do you consider your superpower to be? What would you tell me? What would you describe? You can go ahead and upload your answers directly into the question and answer portal, and we'll kind of go through them. While you're doing that, let me share a little bit about one of my clients that I recently was coaching and so forth. I was asking her, you know, what are her strengths, what are her superpowers, and so forth. And after she thought about this for a little bit, she came up with something that I thought was really unique. You know, she feels her superpower, one of them at least, was turning chaos into order. And she described this, you know, as being able to take very complex situations that are just all over the place and being able to apply, you know, an organization to them to, you know, make them run more efficiently and smoothly. And I thought that was an excellent way. And she gave me a specific example about that. So I'm curious
Yeah.
to hear if anybody else here has any superpowers to share.
Yeah, and feel free to drop your responses below in the Q&A. As I mentioned earlier, again, this is a very interactive, intentional presentation, and take advantage of Andy's wisdom as well. But while you're doing that, I just want to go back one slide quickly, because you talked about your client having this superpower of the organization and being able to turn chaos into order. One of the things I forgot to talk about was, part of the content element of things is also to know the people, right, and decision makers. And so when you turn chaos into order, a lot of times it really is around knowing how the interactions and dynamics work between the leaders. And so one of the things that I always encourage people to do is, before you have an interview, to have confidence not just in the company, but also specifically what is the organizational structure, right? So I'm suspecting that your particular client has that superpower because they know the organization well, and they're also able to understand dynamics, right? So, major leadership movements, so if you're in an organization and you're looking for a promotion, or if you're looking for a new role, to read up on, to understand what the nuances of the leadership's, movements are here and there. In some cases, there may have been promotion internally, right, up to a C-suite. In some cases, there may have been demotion, or maybe in some cases, a transition out. But the news about your company's successes and failures, a lot of that affects the psyche of the person who's recruiting you, right? So it's a hiring manager, especially if it's going to be a very senior role as an SVP or a C-suite, it's going to be the committee, and all these different aspects of chaos that you were talking about is happening in the background. So as much as you could say, listen, I know the situation that you're in, and here's what I've done typically in the past to bring order to that. I think that's a really important superpower to have. I also wanted to mention one more thing, is to, obviously, when you're in a particular role itself, it's easy to forget what the intention of the role is strategically, right? So why are you in that role to begin with? When you're interviewing for a new role, it's all the more important to know what is the purpose of that role strategically, because it's not always obvious, right? So obviously you need to understand the role description, at this point in your careers, with 30, 35 years experience, you would have known this already, is to know the job description, make sure that you understand what they're asking you for. But you'd be surprised at how many people, because many people on the call here have never had to interview before, right? Your career has been successive and very successful, and that's a very typical story. But reading between the lines is also very important. So when you look at a job description, looking at the role itself, it's like, well, what isn't being said, right? That you would expect to be said, but it's not there, right? And you can kind of lean back on your own experiences about how a specific function might need to include other functional elements to work together, but maybe that role doesn't require that. So what does that actually mean? And then you might want to also look at, comparative roles as well, other roles that are in other companies that are similar to that, and how it is that they hire on for those similar positions. And then your requirements versus responsibilities. And I I go back here to your example there, Andy, is, there's requirement responsibility. So, in the particular role that your client is in, there may not be a stated responsibility to be, kind of the calm maker, right, out of chaos. But a requirement out of a good leader is that you need to understand that a large part of your managing is going to be around the soft skills, right? It's going to be around understanding how it is that you bring people together, right? So responsibility may not be explicit, but your requirements are going to be driving, your career forward. So we have a few responses here, Andy. So let's see what some people have said.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So as I'm just kind of going down the list here, we've got
Yeah, sure.
persistence, we've got relationship building, we've got creation, clarity, adaptability, translating vision into advantage. These are all great superpowers, and these are exactly what we're kind of looking at. And if you think about these, there's a couple ways you can come up with your superpower, because some people struggle with this, and it's not common for us to be able to talk about ourselves anyway in a very positive light. Most of us are pretty humble by nature. So what can I do? Well, you can consider what your strengths are, like what we just asked, a superpower. But some ways you can look at this is you can think about to yourself, what are some of the accomplishments that I'm most proud of? What are some of the things that I've been able to do, in my current role or in my past role that really made a difference for the company? Where was that value that I've created? Sometimes
Mhm.
it's best to take a look at it from an outside perspective. What has my boss said? What are my reviews said? Who's given me compliments over the years, and what were they about? What were they an attaboy or attagirl about a certain project that I worked on? And what
Mhm.
was that project, and how did I do it? The whole purpose of what you're trying to do here is really kind of build up a library of these superpowers and examples. Um, my suggestion is that you really want to try to get 3 to 5 superpowers in your portfolio. And it's not just having a superpower, it's also giving an example that demonstrates what this superpower is, and why is it valuable, and how was it used, and how was it being important. Now, that's a lot of information. So, what I will tell you
Mhm.
in an interview situation is you probably don't have all that much time to go through all of those details. So, you want to really
Right.
kind of practice these and get this down to about 90 seconds. So that's usually the best, and let the interviewer ask further questions of you.
Yeah, there's one here in particular that I really, really appreciate. Someone had written down translating vision into advantage. Andy, what do you think about that? This ability to kind of take strategy and vision, which is
Mhm.
a really big concept, and then taking that into, how does that mean as an advantage for an organization?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, when we're talking about, a senior role, maybe a C-level role, whether it's a CEO, COO, or CTO, or so forth, the strategy piece really, becomes much, much, much more important than ever before. And, utilizing, what a company vision is and how that can translate into, what can
Mhm.
you do to actually execute and make that happen is a great superpower to be able to share and have, because it's really demonstrating your value that you can bring at that very high level within the organization. So I love it. It's great.
Right. There's a comment here, a really interesting comment. So going back to your comment on where the puck is going to be, this particular person says, I have come across executives who are happier where the puck is and react to existing market dynamics. Whether that's the organizational culture or an individual trait, tough to tell. Should we move on from the conversation? So, what do you do, Andy, to develop superpowers where, for example, if the executive is, perfectly fine where things are, they're slow to move. We've kind of encountered, kind of organizations that are like that, very, very slow to steer the ship. What kind of superpower there would be helpful in order for kind of generating some momentum, getting the ship going per se?
Sure. Well, and this is one of the reasons why I recommend kind of having those 3 to 5 superpowers in your portfolio, because not every superpower is going to fit the interview
Right.
situation. And you're going to be able to see that as the interview is kind of going along, maybe you might gravitate towards 1 or 2 of these. Um, I never make it a policy of saying, well, I've got to get all three or all five superpowers into an interview. I think that's too much. So the whole point of having those in your back pocket is to really leverage the ones that are going to work better. In this situation, it may be, doing more with what we have from that standpoint. That
Hmm.
might be something that we want to
Right.
look at instead of saying we're going to go down new paths and explore new opportunities and new areas. How can I optimize, what we're already facing? How can I make things better, more
Right.
profitable, more cost effective, and so forth? That might be the angle that you would want to take in something like that
Right.
situation.
Gotcha. That's great, Andy. I'm moving to the next slide here.
So the other thing we want to talk about when you're preparing and talking about your credibility and talking about yourself is have you think about what challenges and obstacles you have faced, in your roles and in your jobs. And I've got a couple notes here. One, I say positive outcomes only. And the reason I say positive outcomes only for this is we're going to talk about failures in a moment. So right now, I want to
Hmm.
focus on the positive. What kind of challenges have you faced? What were you able to do? How were you able to get over them? And what was that positive result in the end with this? These types of questions to ask yourself and to practice these challenges and obstacles are really going to help you with behavioral and situational questions that are going to be coming up in an interview. When someone
Right.
says, ask you, tell me about a time that you and your boss had a disagreement over a project. What was that and how did it get resolved? I
Hmm.
mean, something like that is going to be a great thing that you can use a challenge and an obstacle uh, that you have kind of at your fingertips and ready to talk about, for example. And that's how you kind of prepare for some of these.
Right.
I do recommend, putting together two or three examples once again. And as again, you're trying to keep this to 90 seconds or less for your delivery for what is that obstacle or challenge, and then what was the story or result behind it.
So, Andy, I have a
Simeon, do you
question
have
for you
anything
there.
you want to add there?
Yeah, I had a question for you. Can you hear me? Oh, can you hear me, Andy?
Yeah, I can hear you just fine, Simeon.
Yeah, my question was, we often get asked, so what is the difference here with a more mid-level role versus a more senior role, right? So how do we tailor the story of our challenges and obstacles in such a way that it doesn't get into the weeds, but it really sort of stays at the
Mm.
level of strategy, right? So is there any difference as far as how we structure, the outcomes and examples that we provide?
Absolutely. I mean, think about, I always like to look at who your audience is when we're doing this. And if your audience, you're in this interview and you're presenting to, let's say, a C-level executive or the board of directors, even more likely in some cases, what are going to be the things that are going to be top of their mind in this situation?
Mm.
Well, usually it's going to be something around profitability and growth of the organization. How have you affected, that? It's going
Right.
to have to deal with how did you mitigate or reduce risk within an organization? Or what kind
Mhm.
of transformation have you been able to take an organization through? Those are
Right.
three things that resonate really well with these senior level executives, boards, and so forth. So, taking that in mind, and thinking about, well, what obstacles or challenges have I maybe faced and overcome in one of those areas, would be a very, good strategic, high level answer that you could provide for that type of situation versus talking about something that, oh, well, I met this deadline, that was getting a product out the door that I did 20 years
Mhm.
ago, where that's not going to be
Right.
as important of what you're talking about now.
Yeah. And just going back very quickly to the reason why we put this on the slide and Andy's speaking about this, how does that relate to credibility, right? So at the end of the day, what you present forward as you've got options, right? Well, if you're asked for challenges and obstacles, you could give, 15, 20 different examples. Why did you choose those two or three, right? And that goes back to credibility because if you can choose ones that are strategic and very concise and to the point and really, really sharp and crisp, I mean, that really speaks a lot to your credibility, right? It speaks a lot to your commitment and your confidence as well, that you know which ones really, really move the needle and which ones are kind of, when they're not really that important, right? So anyway, sorry, sorry to stop you there, Andy.
No, that's fine. I think we're kind of ready to move on to the failures here. And I like talking about failures because most people don't from that standpoint. Most of us are find this is probably one of the hardest things to talk about, where we failed in an interview. I mean, we're interviewing here, so we always want to show the best possible traits and qualities that we can bring. We want to talk
Mhm.
about the value add. Why do I want to get down and bog down into a failure and so forth? Well, the first thing is that you have to understand that, a failure really only is a failure if you don't learn from it from that standpoint. And all of us as successful executives, have gone and experienced failures of our own. No one out
Mhm.
there ever has 100%, record for this. And
Right.
if we did, we're not innovating, to be honest with you, because that's how innovation usually comes about is what we learn from our failures and what we can do different and how we can do it better. I always like to say, look, everybody experiences setbacks, somewhere. Even Superman has a weakness of kryptonite in this. I think probably what the best thing I can do here is kind of maybe take you through one of my failures and so forth and share that a little bit with you.